were doing committees in California about reparations for a state that never had slavery, and no one in the state of California has ever owned a slave. It makes no sense. It's like if you're an immigrant from Asia and you've moved to California and you've worked your ass off to have whatever, and now the state is saying, oh, by the way, you coming from some really hard circumstance and you've kind of done everything in your life right, and you've paid taxes and you've done all this stuff. By the way, you need to go pay reparations for something that happened, 150 plus years ago, and the state didn't even have any slaves. It's just so stupid. Like it's like housing is the problem. Solve housing.
Last couple weeks in Miami, and then I go to New York for June, and I'm going to play it by ear.
Are you still planning to move to SF?
Yeah. I'm planning to move to SF, but I'm open as to timeline.
Cerebral Valley is really calling you.
Yes.
Or is it the open air drug markets? I'm never quite sure with you, Eric, what you're looking for. Maybe a little bit of both.
Exactly. Yeah. Why not both, as the meme says. Yeah. I messaged Antonio in the chat, but he's moving today. He seems to be moving all the time. But yeah, ever since he fully converted, he's been even more finicky and neurotic. I'm just kidding.
You're allowed to say that. I can't say any of that kind of stuff. I mean, he's still in the Latinx tribe, so we can exactly. Kind of play those jokes across the board. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not part of that tribe.
Yeah. Twitter new CEO kind of came out of nowhere. Seems like it's confirmed. It's this woman who worked at NBC previously. What do we know about this new Twitter CEO? And let's talk about it.
So I only know what I read on the internet. So it sounds like she's from NBC Universal, hard charging. They call her the Velvet Hammer, I think is her nickname, that's kind of a badass nickname. I actually have a friend who worked at NBC Universal doing like ad sales for television. And I'm going to see her in a couple of weeks when we're on the East Coast. So I'm kind of excited to kind of maybe hear some of the stories. But I don't know. To me, it just seems reasonable. Like the advertisers have gone away and you need to bring those people back. This woman has deep relationships with these people. I think there was one anecdote that was whoever was running the PR for this, and Elon's probably not doing that, but her PR people were very good because the stories were all, I think, quite complimentary of her relationships and how she's a relationship-oriented executive in that during COVID, she let people out of their ad contracts and when people were freaking out, and I think people didn't forget that. So I would imagine it's going to be good for their ad business. If you remember, like Twitter's original COO, Adam Bain, who's a friend, came from, I think, Fox and had been in that world. And so I think Twitter's original model, because they didn't monetize as well as Facebook, and we're going to get a text from Shriram afterwards telling us like that you don't understand. But my very simplistic view of the world, and we're now talking about ads, by the way, and Antonio's skipping the podcast. But Twitter has just never been able to monetize at the same level as Facebook for a variety of reasons, whether it's tech or just how people use the product. Twitter has like kind of this like equivalent to television where it's like a brand advertising thing rather than kind of a little bit more like app install or intent based, like if you think about Google. So you naturally want people who have those types of relationships. Actually surprised I remember as much from this like one or two articles I read. She was actually supposed to be at NBC's ad summit and she had to step back because she's now taking this job. But apparently they do this kind of one event a year or every couple of years, and they sell $100 billion worth of ads, which is kind of interesting to think about. Like, when was the last time you watched network television?
I can't even remember.
Well, if you watch any live sports, you're watching network. But like, what's amazing to me is the resiliency of these kind of like major networks, and obviously there are cable channels and stuff like that, to still be a place that advertisers want to buy. And a lot of that's actually driven off of like the few live events that people watch today, most of which are sports, right? Like the Oscars and Grammys, they have way less engagement than they did historically. That's still a really, really lucrative market. Obviously, the NFL benefits from that, and NBA because they can sell the ad slots to those networks. But getting back to this new CEO, what's interesting about this is she basically is just going to run the business side of things. She's giving product and kind of design and sysops, as Elon said, to to Elon. And if you actually think about it, he's already shown that he can work pretty well in this model. And a little bit of perspective is my wife used to work at SpaceX. Gwen Shotwell has effectively been running SpaceX for, last 10 years or so. And Elon, I think, moves to the highest kind of like critical path item in any one of these companies. But the reality is like the kind of like sales of those rocket launches, Elon's not doing those sales at this point. He's focused on Starship or kind of whatever the next milestone to get to Mars. And Gwen is responsible for building the organization that actually goes and sells the satellite providers, or, kind of like implements how Starlink is actually now global and all that kind of stuff. So he I think does a nice job on that yin and yang. And by the way, this is how Steve Jobs worked with Tim Cook, right? Like Steve Jobs doesn't care about logistics and like the machine that Apple has built. Tim Cook was kind of that nice complement to Steve Jobs, who could just float on whatever he thought was the most important thing. So this model actually works in high performing, high innovation technology companies. And I think my favorite part of this is you have this whole group of progressive folks who Rocket Man bad because he has the wrong opinions, or he's petty, all the things that you can, I think, make some legitimate criticisms of how Elon behaves publicly. But he now has, if you just think about it, 2 of maybe call it 5 or 10 most valuable private companies. And you could say, yes, Twitter has come down in value, but the reality is it's still a valuable thing, and it's private. 2 of the 10 most valuable private companies, and they're run by women, extremely competent women who are, not like some DEI hire type thing, but like, no, they've proven themselves from a career in being excellent. And Elon, they work with Elon. And so if you can kind of take all these other woke kind of companies, all run by men, and like not, and so I think it's just like an amazing kind of like the guy in the red suit meme where he has to pick the button and he's sweating, and it's like praise Elon because he actually is moving the world forward with extremely competent women just based on their competence, not their gender, or like extremely woke progressive politics where it's like mood affiliation. And so I just, it just like tickles me funny in the sense that you just like have these head explode for people.
Well, what was the inflection point as to when Elon started getting really coded as right wing? Or maybe there were a few inflection points where it like really ramped up. Remember a few years ago when he, the message received to the California politician who, sort of threatened him in terms of more taxation, or I can't remember. Like, I feel like that might have been one moment. Like, because a few years ago, he was more neutral, right? Like, what were the inflection points as to when he increasingly got coded right wing, or coded even like treated it as we treat Trump?
Yeah, look, I don't have like a really scientific analysis. I do have 2 data points for you, or two kind of thoughts. So the first is massive increase in wealth during COVID. And that's a combination of the zero interest rate, stimulus related stuff. And what's interesting is I think a lot of people don't appreciate Elon had a very special deal when Tesla was kind of going almost bankrupt. What was it, 2018 or so? He got this insane comp package where if he hit stock-based price milestones, he got more and more of the company. And with the run-up, it made him that much wealthier, which kind of, I think, created this meme around Tesla, right? Like the big Tesla bears, and there's some truth to this, is that Tesla's way overvalued relative to the progress they've made. Yet, like, if you actually just look at the progress for electric cars, like Tesla is like, I think 50% of the market in the US or something like that. So he got really, really wealthy, right? He passed Jeff Bezos. And then I think that the other thing, and I think someone shared this, is the number of tweets per year from Elon is like a hockey stick growth. So I think he's kind of bored in COVID. This is my theory. Bored in COVID, breaks up with Grimes or whatever. Like, so he's just like spending more and more time on Twitter. And so that, I think, becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where, look, if you spend more time on Twitter and you've got so many followers, right? And I think he went from something like 80 million followers to 120 million. He might even be higher now. And so it kind of like becomes this thing where Twitter starts to own you. I mean, it's like one of our favorite topics on this show is to just talk about like Twitter is upstream of everything. Everything is downstream of Twitter. Twitter is the arena. But I think like when your brain is on Twitter and you have 120 million followers, like, and you're the richest person in the world, you start to kind of maybe like everyone talks about FU money. It's like, okay, now I'm at the point of doing that. And I think as a result, in that kind of climate where people are talking about wealth taxes and all this other, like, eat the rich, billionaire type stuff, he became kind of this poster child for like, okay, this person shouldn't have this much money because he's not responsible, or he's, to use the SBF term, the woke shiblets
Yeah.
that we say. So he's not kind of like playing into the kind of elite. Like he's deviating. And I think if anything, he's doubling down on the fact that his fanboys are on Twitter are kind of not in that group. And so now I think it's only become a self-perpetuating cycle. And what's interesting, and I think that this is something that he has to really be careful about, like for Twitter, is Twitter, I think, has definitely taken a little bit more of a right-leaning move since his acquisition. And part of that is this subscriber thing, which I actually think is good because he's created so much of a kind of like Rocket Man bad issue. He's not, at least my observation, there aren't that many kind of left of center people using Twitter subscriptions, because just like the blue check has become this kind of like, alt-right symbol basically for a certain set of people. And I'm kidding there. It's not an alt-right symbol, but I think what he's going to have a challenge with is if all of the people who are using subscribe, like the pink super follow type thing, are right of center or whatever that political affiliation, he's actually going to create a perpetuating cycle. And so going back to the CEO, I think what's great about that is that it seems like, there's a bunch of tweets like this where basically it's like the left seems to be as pissed about her as the right. And that's actually probably what you want, is someone who feels neutral and not coded one way or another, because Elon's always going to kind of do what he wants to do. And so I'm still extremely bullish on Twitter under Elon, just given that the thing I think people underrate is how slow big companies usually just move. And Twitter was like on the very slow end of big companies. And I think he's just reinvigorating it in a way that is much more iterative, willing to try things and fail, and liveness from like a company standpoint in terms of product and iteration is dramatically underrated. And obviously he does that with SpaceX. It's a little harder to do with Tesla. Kind of like you're even starting to see it with Google, right? Like Google now has this existential threat with OpenAI plus Microsoft. And there are a whole bunch of stories that have come out where they basically said that like Sundar is just saying like, nope, okay, put those alignment people AI alignment people like Google are a zero interest rate phenomenon. Like it's just like, okay, like we can be fat and lazy and like, talk about the ethics of this stuff. And the reality is Google's business is under threat, and they need to show that they actually have supremacy in AI stuff. And so they did their first attempt at it in kind of like a half-assed way, and they got eviscerated. The stock went down. And then this week, Google I/O, I think, was generally pretty well received. It had, $150 billion or some insane amount. They're a $1.3 trillion company, so it's hard to move that needle. But the market rewarded them for kind of looking like they were being more aggressive. And that's interesting because like, when was the last time you thought of Google as being like fast and aggressive? And so I do think it's a combination of the macroeconomic environment with like, okay, money is getting more expensive. And I do think Elon expanded the Overton window around like, oh, Twitter still works, right? Like everyone thought that Twitter was like 2 weeks away from falling apart. And it's like, still works. It looks like they're making progress, maybe bumbling along on sideways, but the reality is they took out 80% of the cost. And I think Zuck is a great example of this, where a founder-led company, he's making, kind of like that observation and then saying, wait a second, like we need to get lean too. You have the Brad Gerstners of the world who think that their letter is the reason. But the reality is like Zuck is founder-controlled company. That's those super voting shares work. And so now you're in a situation where I think every one of these big companies, we're in an environment before would have been a layoff shows a sign of weakness. Now it's actually seen as a sign of vitality and strength, which worth pointing out is like when you have tens of thousands of people losing jobs, like that's not like something to be celebrated. But I do think it is getting Silicon Valley back into a much more reality focused world of like, okay, the stock market wants to see real cash flow and not spending money on kind of fantasy projects as much as like you need to actually be able to go tell a good story. And so, but that all goes back to Elon, right? Like Elon is the kind of upstream of everyone, both in Twitter, but also like making these decisions at Twitter. I think has flowed down into these other companies.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. I want to tell you about my new interview show, Upstream. Upstream is where I go deeper with some of the world's most interesting thinkers to map the constellation of ideas that matter. On the first season of Upstream, you'll hear from Mark Andreessen, David Sachs, Balaji, Ezra Klein, Joe Lonsdale, and more. Make sure to subscribe and check out the first episode with Mark Andreessen. The link is in the description. Secureframe is the leading all-in-one platform for security and privacy compliance. Secureframe helps you get SOC 2 audit ready in weeks, not months, and it's used by thousands of companies like AngelList, Coda, and Remote. I believe in the company so much I invested in it, and I recommend it to all my portfolio companies. Sign up for a free demo at secureframe.com and mention Moment of Zen during your demo to get 20% off your first year of Secureframe. MarketerHire is one of my favorite resources for growing startups looking to hire marketers. Hiring is hard, and the time it takes from founders could be better leveraged elsewhere. MarketerHire pre-vets top-notch marketers across a dozen roles, whether you need help with growth marketing, SEO, lifecycle content, or any other aspect of growth marketing strategy. It's free to use, and you only pay if you end up hiring someone. If you want to hire a great marketer the easy way, MarketerHire is offering Moment of Zen listeners a $1,000 credit for first-time customers. Go to marketerhire.com/MOZ and use code MOZ for your $1,000 credit. There's a few things I want to respond to there. First is the Elon sentiment idea. It's fascinating because some people respond. There are two different ways to respond to kind of journalists attacking you. And, you like Zuckerberg, in the sort of Trump era, Cambridge Analytica era, like the Facebook approach was to apologize. Apologize, say we'll do better. We acknowledge the harm, even reluctantly. The Balaji approach and the approach that Elon took is to triple down. And you started to see Elon, partly for the reasons you mentioned, he started getting a lot richer, start to get attacked. What they thought would happen was that he would back down, he would apologize, and he would acquiesce more. But what ended up happening is he started to see the media as an enemy. Remember, he posted about like a Yelp for journalists, right? Like, and he's always, not gotten the credit he deserved for the environmental impact he's had. Like, he is a first principles thinker. And so he started to realize the cracks in the stories. And once you realize a crack in a few stories, you start to question a lot more things. And so if you notice, he's been questioning things that happened many years ago, like the Michael Brown, verdict in Ferguson, or the crime statistics or police statistics that led to the, June 2020. Like in the past year, he started to question a lot of the things that maybe he wasn't questioning recently. And that was, in my opinion, sort of energized by the attacks on him that started to sort of change his view from a moderate liberal or sort of left leaning to more right wing coded in terms of at least tribe. Maybe not ideas. He's a free market. He's probably for social freedoms as well. So he's freedom oriented in nature, or liberal oriented in nature. But I think he realizes that there's one party that's attacking him, and that party has all the power, or has a lot of power, institutional power, and that's why he's acted accordingly. Maybe.
Yeah, it's look, easy to be an armchair and criticize the strategy, but like the one thing I think about is, should he be dialed if you kind of like a spectrum of like +10 right wing, +10 left wing, and 0 is the the kind of middle there. Should he be clicking as close to 0 one way or another, but like for the benefit of actually the goals that he wants to achieve? And maybe one of the goals that he wants to achieve is actually, polling society in a certain political direction, which is fine. That's his prerogative to go do that. But if I view it as like, if he's really saying, hey, getting humans to interplanetary, multiplanetary species and, sustainable energy future, I think a kind of slightly more, at least publicly, diplomatic and left-leaning Elon might actually be able to achieve his goal, because I think it becomes someone to rally behind. And I think the one downside, again, he's free to share whatever opinions he wants. Like that's a core fundamental right of being an American. But I think from a strategy standpoint, I look at someone like Sam Altman, who he has a very singular goal, right? And I think he's very good at being diplomatic to the right degree. And I actually don't know what his personal politics are, even if you might hear from people here or there. They are a little bit more um, acceptable within the kind of elite structure, which I actually think plays well, right? He's getting invited to the White House for the AI stuff. Like, he's having the ability to shape that. And so it's interesting, because obviously Teal is another example of someone who's just been very focused on, like, okay, this is my public set of beliefs, and I am actually going to try to effectuate my set of policies in a very open way. But look at the Teal version of, like, taking down Gawker. Like, that to me is like, okay, that's like master level stuff, in the sense that he had a 10-year plan, and he was
Yeah.
able to go do it, and that was quiet. And maybe post that he was never going to be able to do that again. But and look, he got a Senate candidate in. So with JD Vance and the Trump thing, I think I'd say net positive for him within the circles that he cares about, but I think probably very net negative, in the sense that, like, his brand kind of went from this eccentric investor type to kind of basically the next version of the Cokes is Teal, right? Like, Teal backed is the thing now, which has its own coded stuff. And so I do wonder of, like, what is the optimal strategy if you tell me that get humans to being interplanetary species in a sustainable energy future are like your two top priorities? What is the right, at least public persona to play with? I always feel fraudulent when I'm criticizing someone who's, like, very much in the arena, in the sense that not only the rockets and the electric cars, but he's also running the arena itself. And so I just, I don't know. It's a fun thing to muse about, in the sense that, like, what would be the kind of, like, dial you would change, assuming you were in his position.
So I agree with you that Sam is very strategic and is having a lot of success. I also think that if Elon had created OpenAI with the speech restrictions or kind of political coding that ChatGPT has, he would not be happy with that. Hence why he's wanting to create a competitor. And so it's like, could Sam have created ChatGPT that was, like, politically neutral? Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know. But it seems that one of Elon's goals is also to have to introduce free speech, or to introduce the marketplace of ideas, or what. Like, he seems to care about the state of public discourse. Certainly, he's seen how it affects his companies, or the sort of speech restrictions, or sort of excessive activism. So I think he sees it he sees it as a tax on growth, and on technological progress. I think he sees it as related. But I also agree that he's too interested in truth for his own good. Like, the idea of getting into crime statistics, or the Michael Brown thing, or other thing, or the Pelosi thing, or whatever, like, it doesn't help him. Even if he might be right on any of those individual things, I don't see how it's advancing his goals.
Yeah, and maybe one of his goals, again, is he wants the world to have a slightly different political persuasion, and so that he's
Well,
entitled
I
to
think
that
it's
goal.
less. I think it's less about political persuasion. I think he is very interested in truth, right? He's interested in sort of the, like. Are you cynical on that, or?
Like, how do you measure truth? It's almost like an effective altruism version of the, like, it's like, oh, I've increased net truth in the world. My personal view is, yeah, that's probably a good thing. Like, if and again, hard to measure. It's like, who decides? But if you just had a magic way of kind of, like, can you increase truth? Yes or no? I think more truth in the world is probably a good thing. The way I think about it, though, is, like, going back to the ChatGPT example. So, personal view, I don't think there should be any political. I think they're completely uncensored. Like, we live in a society of adults, and we have a constitution. Like, we should have a full marketplace of ideas, and that's the case. However, put yourself in the position of OpenAI. You're out in front, and this thing, as you get it more sophisticated, is naturally going to attract the attention of policymakers. If you had to pick, just simple strategy, do you code it more left acceptable and have the right be a little bit pissed at you? Or do you code it right and then have the left be pissed at you?
You code it left. Yeah.
Right. So that's the optimal move, the chess move. And so whether I agree with that or not, I can also, game respect like in the like, okay,
Yeah.
like that is the right move if you are trying to make progress towards AGI, which if you actually think about like what they are really trying to get to is like, yeah, ChatGPT 4 is amazing, but like AGI is going to be really crazy, right? Like it's not going to just be Twitter thread boys being like, look at these 10 cool things that I did with ChatGPT 4. It's just like it fundamentally changes the way humanity works, right? It's like singularity level stuff. So I think that's actually the definition of the singularity. So I think I just find it interesting to kind of think of like, okay, what is the optimal move, assuming a goal? And I think the counter to that is sometimes maybe they're non-publicly stated goals, right? So if I just take Elon on face value, I think his strategy is suboptimal relative to what he's trying to achieve. But easy for me to say, I haven't built reusable rockets and mainstream electric cars.
For the audience who's asking, hey, how is ChatGPT politically coded? Just some examples. If you say things like, say a joke about Muhammad, it won't let you do that. But if you say a joke about Jesus, it will let you do it. Or if you say something, nice about Trump, it will, say it won't do that. But if you say something nice about Biden, it will do that, or some variation. They're treated differently. And there's like dozens of examples. If you ask about crime statistics, it won't weigh in. If you ask about attractiveness, it won't weigh in. There are dozens of examples where it's been, if not hundreds, where it's been sort of, designed to say a more politically correct response and kind of deny or not reveal what reality is.
Well, what was the Microsoft chatbot? Taylor?
Yeah, Tay or something.
But this is a few years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, just look at what happened. The media is just going to immediately look for the like, if you can get ChatGPT say something nice about Nazis, you get a ton of clicks. So again, separating my own personal like how do I think the world should be versus like what is the optimal strategy. You don't want ChatGPT praising Nazis or anything like that. The media, it can turn it into a story. And so it is far better from just trying to make progress and avoid regulatory oversight that is, kind of hampering said progress. If basically the stories are from the New York Post and Fox News versus the New York Times and the Washington Post.
I am sympathetic. There's this broader critique that the Eliezers or people like that will make, where they'll say, hey, stop worrying about AI ethics, like on either side. Like forget that it's not left enough or forget that it's too left, because what really matters is like if we get AGI, that's like a threat to humans, and their like political leanings is going to be the last thing that we're concerned about. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to that argument to the extent that there's a possibility of that on some multi-decade timeline. At the same time, like it is important what who's in charge of that, what that is used for, how is it coded, and so it's less that the individual speech restrictions on their own are so egregious, and it's more, is it a harbinger of what's to come in terms of the ability to control this thing and influence this thing in one direction. And if it's one direction, it can become a bit authoritarian on either side.
I think if you just take the total number of GPUs in existence and the ability to manufacture those GPUs, and you kind of just extrapolate out that each of these models, at least the current form of how they get better, is you just throw more compute and a bigger data set. And there's actually a really good interview Patrick Collison did of Sam Altman this past week. And it's just always fascinating, right? It's like, so Patrick Collison is like a real technologist. So when he's asking Sam Altman questions about AI, it's infinitely better than any journalist, because like Patrick can reason about this stuff because, he's an actual computer scientist. So it's this fantastic interview, but if you kind of just think about like these models, like Sam is talking about synthetic data. And so if you just kind of read between the lines a little bit, that's like, okay, we ran out of data on the internet for these models to train on. So if you're having to create new data to kind of like create this like reinforcing loop, one that it seems like that's not proven. Maybe it is in the lab at OpenAI and they just haven't released it yet. But if you've run out of data and it's just a game of like, you need massive access to these GPU clusters, I actually don't think there is any version of this escaping out. Like the Chinese have had all of their chip supplies like totally hampered in terms of The U.S. has all these sanctions now related specifically to chips, and obviously they can still buy them on the open market, but like it gets harder and harder to have the best stuff from NVIDIA or whomever is building this stuff. You know, I think Google has some stuff, and then obviously Apple has its own silicon team. But you're going to be limited to a set of companies, and those companies are going to then play the optimal strategy around like how do we make money from this thing without having necessarily a ton of regulatory oversight and or like play within the existing framework. Now, what's interesting about OpenAI is they're not public, and I do think because they are still founder led in the sense that Sam has very clearly said AGI is the priority. They are going to be a much more interesting one to watch relative to Google or Apple, which have public shareholders and kind of exist in a framework where their core businesses are susceptible to other types of regulation if they're doing something like it's the mafia thing. It's like, oh, nice iPhone business or a nice search business. It'd be a shame if we came in and did something here if you're not kind of following the kind of guidance that's coming down from what I would call the Borg of the elite class. So I think OpenAI is the interesting one. I know now obviously if Elon has his own, again private, then you actually have an interesting race because these are people who are only accountable to their investors, which at that point, like I just really the founder. So that's actually the more interesting one. So when I go to all these people like worrying about like safety or whatever, the reality is you're just not going to have access to the amount of compute outside of some breakthrough in technology, like some equivalent of like a transformer or GPT for the the next thing, and it's like it vastly improves the efficiency of how to trade in these things. But it's basically going to be a game of like OpenAI with Microsoft providing the data center stuff. I think it'll be, Google has really smart people, but is a public company. And then I think it'll be Elon and then China. Like that's it. Like no one else will be relevant. And so those are four entities that are, I think, somewhat easy to control. Modulo China can just do whatever it wants. But if you continue to cut off access to the chips, then I think China is just going to be significantly behind.
Some people might be listening and say, hey, this is the problem with billionaires. It's not that they're too rich. It's that they don't have accountability. It's that, these platforms like Facebook or Twitter or OpenAI are at the whims of these founders who have founder super voting shares. And shouldn't the public or shouldn't the government step in and there be public accountability? And I think the misnomer is that when those things are controlled or influenced by the government, 99% of the government is not elected and is not can't be fired. So there's actually zero accountability. This is what people talk about when they talk about the Borg, is they talk about an unaccountable bureaucracy that is just there indefinitely and doesn't have to really answer to anybody. And so it's either you have full control or you have no control. It's either like a dictatorship, either by someone like Elon or someone like Zuck, or there's no one is responsible, and it's just kind of this web of bureaucratic stultification and sclerosis and madness. And if you want gridlock, that's actually a good thing to have. But if you want progress, you want someone who can make decisions, but like a dictator. But the challenge is that the progress could go both ways. There's just more variance in that progress. But I just wanted to point out that misnomer that Facebook in theory could be publicly accountable in a way that is influenceable by the public, when in reality, most of the government is neither elected, neither voted for, nor accountable to market forces in any capacity.
Well, let me push back a little bit on the Facebook one. So first of all, the market held Facebook accountable in the sense that Facebook stock went, it was significant decrease. Everyone was, it's the meme where the guy's throwing his fingers down in front of the grave, like, oh, Zuck's done, the Twitterati types just loving the meta decline. It's like, this is over. And now I think that, the stock has doubled, almost tripled. And they have this open source model, like the Llama model or whatever. And it's like, oh, Facebook has legit, even Rune on Twitter is actually talking about how legit Facebook engineering culture is. And so it's like, that was greatly exaggerated in terms of their death. And so the market punished them and then has now rewarded them based on change. So I do think that is a force. Now, obviously, that is weighted by capital, not individual votes. But the individual vote metric for Facebook is this. Do you know how many daily active users Facebook has across all of its apps?
2 billion?
3 billion. They've never basically not increased it. Like
Wow.
they just continue to march. So I think there's like 4 billion smartphones. It's like a Benedict Evans thing. 3 billion of those people use a Facebook product every day. Okay. Like not just like once a month. So it basically have saturated the entire like world in terms of like you have a smartphone, like you probably use a Facebook product. And so that's super interesting in my mind in that you say, oh, these aren't accountable. There is no one forcing you to use Facebook. Maybe you can make an argument that in the kind of the outside the US, WhatsApp has become the de facto communication system. So that I'm a little bit more sympathetic to, like, okay, like make an argument that like this should be a public good. But here's the reality. When it goes to this open standard SMS, first all of the telcos are like they charge that the price per like amount of data that you're sending in SMS that they were charging prior to WhatsApp coming around was like make printer ink look cheap, right? And so WhatsApp has basically been this amazing public good in my view. And then the thing that they did, which I give the founders credit before they left, is they implemented the double ratchet encryption model from Signal. And so what's interesting about WhatsApp is if you don't have the backups turned on, Facebook doesn't know anything that you're saying. They're basically letting you use this system that is extremely reliable, right? Extremely scalable. And there's been a ton of kind of government pressure all over the world. I think Brazil is the best example. I think they put the GM of WhatsApp Brazil in prison because they wouldn't break the encryption scheme so that they could kind of whatever they were trying to do. And so I do think WhatsApp, which is I think their biggest product outside of their core, Facebook product, but like that's an amazing public good in the world. And like I it'd be hard pressed to come up with a reasonable argument that this is not like a massive net benefit to humanity. And granted, they didn't invent it, like they acquired it, but extremely prescient. I think they acquired it in 2014 or 2015. Like, and at the time, people were like $17 billion. What are you versus now that basically like communication runs on a Facebook product, and they really haven't, I think, significantly monetized it. But everyone who uses a Facebook product, for the most part, is voluntarily choosing, especially Facebook and Instagram. I think the WhatsApp point is a little bit more that's actually become the de facto way most people around the world communicate. But like, if Facebook was so evil and terrible and people didn't like the product, they wouldn't be using it. And so, like, a good example also of this is Instagram did this thing where they basically said, hey, we're going to stop showing photos by default. We're going to show you a few, and then we're going to show you reels because to respond to TikTok. And Kim Kardashian and all this virtue signaling around, like, oh, don't change Facebook, like cancel or Instagram or whatever. They just released their quarterly earnings. It's like 24% increase in time spent in Instagram watching reels, right? So it's like they knew that it was going to kind of work. It's just going to take them time. And realistically, what is that displacing? It's displacing people's time spent watching TV, right? Like it's just like people were watching TV before, and there was like kind of no moral crusade around TV at this point because there's some new fancy thing. But I'm sure if you go back to like the 60s, 70s, 80s, the moral crisis of how many people are watching TV, Americans are watching the boob tube, and like so there's always just going to be some complaint around whatever is actually grabbing people's attention. And I think that this is going back to the Elon thing. Attention is the scarcest resource, right? From just like pure consumer standpoint. And that's why advertising is valuable and all this other kind of stuff. And so what the Borg or the elite, whatever you want to call it, the cathedral is really frustrated with, and it's like a collective frustration, but prior to these technology platforms, which can be owned by kind of a single founder and they can make the decisions for it. It used to be all the institutions that they controlled, right? Not to say that the New York Times isn't controlled by a nepotistic dynasty of people, but the whole point is that the attention and what was important, like they had a lot more editorial control over. Whereas obviously the New York Times is important today, but vastly less important in my point of view, like in terms of like setting the collective discussion. It is a huge node and arguably more important than it ever was as a single newspaper. Because now, like, all the other small newspapers have gone away, and it's really just the New York Times, maybe a little bit the Washington Post. But I think the just like Facebook is accountable to both the public markets and users using it. And if people are voluntarily using a product, 3 billion people are using a Facebook product every single day, they're probably doing something right. Unless you want to try to make the argument this is like cigarettes,
That's
right?
what
It's
I was
like,
going to say.
yeah,
That's
yeah. And
that's
so then
yeah.
it's just like, okay. So let's say we just ban all Facebook products or all social media products tomorrow. What are people going to do with that extra time?
Go on other platforms.
Right. But so just say we delete the app store. We delete the internet just like overnight tomorrow. Yeah, it'd be pretty chaotic. But then you get to the point of like, what are people going to do with their time? They're going to start going to, Rotary Club meetings and like, no, they're going to watch television and like you'd have to delete, like, it's just, it's entertainment for people. Like, right. And so I think like Facebook gets this huge thing because of the Trump, Cambridge Analytica, people were just lashing out wanting to blame something. But the reality is, like, most people are on Facebook because it's entertaining, right? Like, Reels is not radicalizing people. Reels is showing you like pickleball clips. If you watched one pickleball clip, and you could just watch an infinite number of pickleball clips.
Just to steel man the pushback. So it would say something like, "Hey, this is a Jonathan Haidt argument. We have an increase."
Maybe explain Jonathan Haidt
Oh, sure.
to those.
So Jonathan Haidt is a professor who has written a couple of great books. One is The Coddling of the American Mind, and which just talks about sort of the rise of kind of activism within universities, or more of the increase of fragility of college students in being able to handle sort of opinions they don't agree with, and so starting to use the sort of therapeutic language of "you've caused me harm" if someone says an opinion you disagree with. And the coddling is that we are not challenging the people who are saying "you're causing me harm." We are sort of ingratiating them or acquiescing to them. Another book he wrote is The Righteous Mind, which is kind of about political psychology of the left and the right, and why they people are psychologically inclined towards one or the other, which I think has been proven right and wrong in some interesting ways.
Can you summarize the core, like what is inclining someone to be left leaning versus right leaning according to that book?
I believe it's that the left is more open to new ideas, open to new people. One test is if a new group of people comes to you at your border or at your house, are you excited to invite them in, learn from them, et cetera, or are you much more protective and think of them as a threat? And so, yeah, left are more open, more interested in diversity, just like instinctively, diversity of all kinds, and the right are more sort of interested in protection, interested in boundaries, interested in tribes. The left is more universalizing, so trying to espouse its values all over. The right is more, hey, this is my family, this is my tribe, this is my people. Just kind of more conservative in instinct. Anything you'd add to that description?
No, I mean, I think it's also, we've talked about the weirdest people in the world book by Joseph Heinrich, but it's very Western. It's kind of left Whig history, this idea of progress and like individualism, and everything gets turned into an atomic unit. Whereas I think the kind of East and this idea of family, the non-Western culture, is by definition more conservative. So you obviously can have left and right within the Western frame, but like the idea that like you start from your kind of like tribe that is much more localized, I do think is more conservative value.
And Jonathan Haidt started Heterodox Academy, which is trying to introduce more political diversity or intellectual diversity within the academy or within universities. Some people think that institution itself has been captured and is too left wing. But bring it back to social media, one of Jonathan's big causes, in fact, this is the next book, and I have a lot of respect for Jonathan, even though I really disagree with him on this topic, is he blames social media for the rise in depression and for the malaise that young people are going through. Now, he has an interesting post recently where he admits or concedes that a lot of that depression is among liberal people. It's among liberal people. It's among women, and I think it's most common within white women, within white liberal women. But that there are big gaps between one, men and women, two, I think across race, and three, certainly between liberals and conservatives. So it's worth asking why is the depression not rising for all groups of people? Why is it just rising for certain groups of people? Anyways, he blames social media. Tristan Harris has a much more fleshed out version of this argument, or they've worked together to really elucidate why, in their view, Facebook, but also just social media in general, is the rise of explains the rise of depression among young women, and he calls for a banning of it, I believe, for under a certain age group at the very least. Kids shouldn't do it.
Let me take the other side of that. So one, I think clinical diagnoses of whatever ADHD, or like, it just feels like you have a society where like diagnosing things is just on the rise. So there's a little bit of like you're actually not measuring it the same way that you used to. Like I have a sense that I've seen enough stuff pop up on Twitter, but I would love a fact check in the comments, so to speak, if that is not the case. I think the second thing, let me give a concrete example. So I have little kids. I take a lot of photos and videos of those kids, or my kids, and I share it in a kind of like private group. It's using Apple's like shared photo album, okay, which has like a little like button and the ability to comment, right? But I'm not putting it out on Instagram in like a public way. There's not that much different between kind of like Instagram, social media, and this Apple product, outside of like, yes, there's this algorithmic feed which will kind of suck you in for it. There's a little bit more of like easier to get exposed to people who are trying to kind of just show you the perfect version of their life versus the vulnerable part. But so now we're kind of like fighting over the details and the implementation. But there is no version in my opinion, where I've just now have this magic technology that I can just snap a photo on the other side of the country from my kids' grandparents, and then they can actually feel, yeah, they're not there, and obviously we try to see them in person, but the idea is that they're being able to see multiple moments a day of their grandkids growing up, and then have the ability to go back and watch it. That's amazing, right? And so I think what just like anything, man bites dog. Like, you always focus on the thing that is going to sell from a story standpoint versus being like, hey, how amazing is FaceTime? Like, why don't we have a story every week just being like, isn't it kind of insane that you can just be anywhere and just like start talking to a loved one, and it's just like in a high fidelity way on your phone? And fast forward in a couple years, when it's like all these phones just have like satellite internet connections with Starlink, and it's like you literally could be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and having a conversation with your grandma. And so I think like, and you can really try to get semantic and be like, well, FaceTime and messaging apps aren't social media versus Instagram and Facebook are bad. But it's like, how many people are actually connecting on Facebook Messenger? How many people are using WhatsApp? Like, how many people are using Instagram DMs? Like, the stories on Instagram close feed. Like, so now you're like wanting to really get into, be like, okay, this class of features is actually productive, and this class is not. But going back to my point, what are most people doing on Instagram? Like, most people don't have other people, in their life that are doing like really fancy things. Who do they follow? They follow an influencer, right? And in my view, if you get rid of that, let's just say you could like ban that somehow, people are still going to crave that. So they are going to get that in television. They're going to get that in People magazine. Like, there is always going to be some outlet for that, because people want to escape, right? Like, their life is hard. It's like, you got all this shit going on. There's a nice version of just being able to kind of be like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if I was that person? And not actually having to think through like walking a mile in their shoes, and just being like, you look at like a Ben Affleck when he's doing something cool, and then half the memes of just like Ben Affleck like smoking the cigarette being like, my life is just like completely relative, right? So I think that is the challenge, is like, people love to just cite these statistics, but it's like, okay, one, is this a measurement issue? And then two, what about the net increase in happiness? Like, from just like, how much happiness is FaceTime added to the world? And why aren't people measuring that, of being like, wow, I'm an older person in a nursing home where I had basically someone come and visit me once or twice a year, but now I'm actually FaceTiming with my grandkids every day, or my great grandkids.
Just to put a pin on that, you think that the depression is either likely a measurement issue, or if it does exist, it's not for the fault of Facebook, but the fault of other things, maybe the loss of religion, maybe the deterioration of cultural fabric, or like what could you attribute it to?
I am of the like belief that all this stuff, these are just tools, right? And they can be used for good and bad, and maybe some are used more for bad than good. But I think it is extremely difficult to measure the absence of something, right? Like whereas you can, if you hone on, so like we always said this when we were at Coinbase with compliance, right? Like you don't get credit for being 99%. Like you only people care about is that 1% of bad. You don't like no one's actually approaching it from. It's the same thing with like nuclear disasters, right? Like we've had nuclear power since the 60s and or 50s even, and you've had basically a handful of these disasters. If you actually look into it outside of Chernobyl put to the side, no one has died from this stuff, and compared to coal. But like it sounds scary, so you're like, oh, like a meltdown, and so now we're gonna actually be irrational on that stuff. And so I think it's like, oh, mass shooting as a result of this shooter being on social media, like, or playing video games, or it's like, well, how many people who otherwise would have been extremely depressed have some more meaning in their life because they're actually getting a little bit more human connection, or they were able to find some weird tribe on a subreddit, or the video games that they're playing actually help them cope with some level of grief. Like it's just they're not going to the Wall Street Journal reporter and telling them that, right? Like it's how do you effectively measure this stuff in society? And so I think people have to just kind of come from an intuitive standpoint is like, I think if you're finding social media is making you depressed, is it the social media, or is it like were you naturally prone to depression? And if you didn't have social media, like if we wind back, would you have just been depressed about something else, right?
I'm going to take the liberals versus conservative question as to why is there more depression, perhaps, or at least reported. And I think there's a number of reasons. One is I think on the left, they more likely acknowledge the existence of depression, such that someone on the right who's feeling the same things might not even call it depression. So that's one. Two, I think it's a selection effect where people who are depressed need support, and so they're more likely to become left because the left acknowledges the existence of, or the importance of mental health support. Three, this is a small effect, meaning it doesn't explain all or most, but I think it explains some. I think in some ways, struggling with mental health implies that you are more worldly, or you care more about the world. Like I don't know if you saw White Lotus season 2, but there's a left wing couple and there's a right wing couple, and the left wing couple is like, or the woman, Audrey Plaza, she's kind of depressed about the state of the world. She doesn't know if she wants to have kids. And the right wing couple is like, what are you talking about? And similarly, there's this character, Portia, who's, talking to this kind of more right coded person who's, lower class. And she's saying, yeah, it's such a bad world. I don't want to bring my kids. You bring kids into this, or, it's the worst of times. And he's saying, what are you talking about? It's the best of times. And so the idea that you are, and what do people often say? I'm so exhausted having to deal with all this politics stuff, or it's causing me harm, or it's affecting my mental health. Trump is affecting my mental health. I think it implies that you care more about the world if you are struggling. Again, I think that only affects a small amount of people, but I think that effect is real. I also think it's sort of the therapy meme. Men will do literally anything other than go to therapy is kind of a left wing meme. I also think that this is Jonathan Haidt's argument, is that excessive leftism has a series of views, or not views, kind of approaches to solving problems that can cause some mental health issues. Like Jonathan names 3 in his book, but one is, instead of attributing sort of responsibility and the ability to work through things, it attributes responsibility of systems and prejudices, and kind of encourages blame of external factors. That's why you are this way. There were 2 other ones. I'll find them and put them in the show notes. But there's like a series of he says it's the opposite of CBT. What cognitive behavioral therapy encourages is kind of like radical responsibility. Everything's within my control, and that leaves you more likely to be able to identify your problems. Where if you equate the locus of control with society or government or prejudice or whatever, you're less likely to have a approach that says, hey, I can work through this on my own. And then lastly is that there are certain social structures in society that probably protect against depression in many cases, like family and religion and patriotism, even just like having something bigger than yourself, having rituals that have proven over time, and a sort of the liberals are less likely to find as much security in those structures because they're less likely to believe in them, or more likely to find fault with them. So those are some of my reasons as to why depression might be higher on liberals than conservatives.
Yeah, my if I step back, I just look at it as this is like a first world, problem. It's a uniquely, call it Europe, American, and then maybe to a certain degree European. I actually have less of point of view on the European side of things, but I think it's just you live in the kind of in Rome, and you have everything, and so your relative set of problems become little problems relative to the real problems of the world, right? Like, and Antonio is the first one to always be like, go to Israel, go to Ukraine. Like, do you think people are worried about, X or Y or social media is making me depressed? It's like, no, I don't want to get hit by a rocket. And so I think the kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as you get wealthier and more stable and secure, and like you don't actually have to worry of a lot of things, you just find new sets of problems. That's, I think, just fundamentally human. And I think an easy way to look at this is look at, if you talk to your average Uber driver, who a lot of times is an immigrant, right? Where are they from? Egypt, Afghanistan, Haiti, and you ask them what they think of this country, they're just think it's the best. Like, it's like, oh man, like, you know, moving here from Haiti has just been like a huge life upgrade, and like it's great. Like, I don't have roving gangs trying to take my family away, or my money, and like I can build a life. I can educate my kids. That's the actual issue. Is like, if I'm sure if you just were to cut it, like first generation Americans versus like every other generation American, where's the depression? And I'm sure it's a pretty significant difference. And I think you just see that the dynamism of Silicon Valley is so much because there are so many immigrants. It's like they're coming from places where it's like life is actually hard, and like you don't have the luxury of saying, "Oh, my mental health is low." It's like you're thinking more about survival. And so when you come to the U.S., you're simultaneously just like, "This is such an amazing country." It's like I can build something of value and not have it taken away from me. And at the same time, they're kind of looking at these other people and are like, "Why are you such like a special snowflake?" Like, it's like, go spend some time actually living in a shitty country. And so I think it's hard because, like, look, I haven't spent significant time outside the U.S. outside of travel. Like, I haven't lived in other places, and so this is a little bit more of an abstract concept for me. But in terms of interacting with immigrants on a daily basis, like a bunch of folks on my team are immigrants to the U.S. and they seem to like it here. They're voluntarily choosing to be in this call it broken society or whatever you want to call it. Like, and this is my argument, which I always bring up with biology, but I love poking this when people are like, oh, the US is in decline, or the US dollar reserve currency or whatever. Where are the immigrants moving? Because they're not moving to China, I can tell you that. And basically there are what, two countries in the world that are like pretty pro immigrant in the sense, or three. So it's like US, bad policy, but that's where the immigrants want to go. Canada is actually very good at getting immigrants. I think they actually beat the US from a policy standpoint, and the UK. And then it's like, yeah, you get some immigration to Germany and to Sweden and whatever, but the reality is, in terms of like the total number, it's the US. And most talented people in the world want to move to the US. Um, so like, why are so many other people depressed? Like, when you have all these other people in these hard circumstances wanting to come here. So I don't think it's fundamentally a problem with America. I think it's like a problem with, like, going back to just like your set of circumstances and the choices that you're making.
But I do sympathize with the idea of, well, in America, it's certainly easier to make a great living and do creative work and have a highest standard of living, and have a great life in so many ways. It's also harder in some ways, maybe, to have a committed family or committed partnership or committed religion, or some of these social structures that might be easier in other countries. And hey, some people, maybe America has higher variance, right? Like we do have high depression and high suicide, right? And these people who need a lot of help. And it's while it's easier to be successful, it's also easier to be reminded of of why you're not successful. And it's easy to feel bad, and it's harder to have some of the attachments that in some other countries have prevented certain people from succeeding at the top. But you can't leave your family, you can't leave your town, you can't leave your city, whatever. You have to stay in the same job. But it have created a certain floor, and so I think America has a higher variance.
Yeah, and I think that's directly correlated to freedom, right? Like, you have all these BS metrics around like, oh, the most free countries in the world or whatever, written by some like, I don't know, think tank. But the reality is, I think if like you were to say what country has the most freedom and all of the problems that come along with that freedom, I would argue that the U.S. For the scale countries, because I always can't stand the like, oh well, this like small 4 million person Scandinavian ethno state like has all this. It's like, come on, like that's like smaller than LA, right? Like in terms of, yeah, you can manage a society at a much smaller, size, but a 350 million person country, like there, call it 10 countries in the world that are roughly over 100 million people, maybe it's 15 now, but like pick one of those countries and show me the one that is the shining example of like a multicultural, like a country that's very pro-immigrant, assimilation, all that kind of stuff. They don't exist, right? It's like China, ethno state, like Japan, ethno state, these. Germany's probably like the best. I don't think that they're over 100 million people, like in terms of integrating different immigrant groups. I mean, the UK also pretty decent, but I think Germany obviously is a more successful economy, although they shut down all their nuclear plants. I just still think it's crazy.
Well, actually, first, I just want to read this quick Fukuyama quote that talks about sort of the first world struggle. The quote goes, "Experience suggests that if men cannot struggle on behalf of a just cause because that just cause was victorious in an earlier generation, then they will struggle against the just cause. They will struggle for the sake of struggle. They will struggle, in other words, out of a certain boredom, for they cannot imagine living in a world without struggle. And if the greater part of the world in which they live is characterized by peaceful and prosperous liberal democracy, then they will struggle against that peace and prosperity and against democracy," which is kind of an interesting point to your first world problem.
Well, I mean, but that, to me, that makes a ton of sense, and so just already thinking of the people who complain about this frame, but like testosterone, male, you are going out and hunting, versus female, at the camp, the kind of like the delineation there, just like a pure biology standpoint. Now, go cancel me. But in that sense, it's like, so you get everything stable and peaceful. That testosterone, where is that going to be exhibited? I don't know. Like, and the more you suppress it and the more plastics that lowers it totally, I think you're going to get a whole bunch of problems in that, right? And so it's like the less physical the world becomes, which I actually think is the trend, you're going to have challenges with that for men, right? Because my belief very much goes with, if you take the distribution of men versus women, you have more women who actually meet in kind of like the middle of the curve, and I think men tend to be more bimodal. So you have a lot of kind of outlier men on both sides relative to the distribution for women, and I don't know if that's been scientifically disproven, but that's my kind of frame for the world. And so as a result, like, stable world for men, and we talked about this in the dating episode or whatever, it like really, really tough, difficult for the group of men that maybe don't have the kind of like, call it white collar knowledge worker skill set, and like instead that they are more physically oriented, and there is really no outlet for them in 2023.
Yeah. Although with AI, who knows how long the white collar.
Sure. No. I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff that will come with that, but I think I think it's a fundamental problem in our society, and I don't know how you change it, because I think the more educated you get, it plays to the people who are good at knowledge work, which is more women are going to beat men at that, because they the low group of men in terms of like who are more physical and don't have the skills, that's a really challenging thing. And so I think we should try to think of ways to actually increase productive physical outlets for men in society, is my point of view.
And in some ways, the military used to be that for many men, right?
Sure. Or working in, a factory that is like very physical, like those jobs are fewer and fewer, right?
But although hopefully maybe there'll be more, with sort of if what Zion predicts happens in terms of the, sort of, rebuilding of the, industrial sector within the U.S. because we retreat, maybe we'll have rise in manufacturing, et cetera.
I don't know. I think what's going to be weird is the AI is going to come for the knowledge workers first, who haven't had a lot of job displacement, so that will be weird. Then the robots will actually work, right? Like Tesla's robot, and then you're going to see the full impact. And I think it's really hard to model how people shift with that, right? I tend to be in the Mark Andreessen camp of human desires are infinite. So we will find new things for people to do. But I mean, if you can predict how that will play out, obviously you can make a lot of money in terms of being an investor or being an entrepreneur, building something.
And the question is, will they have infinite needs that require kind of manual labor or require some of the, skills that this group of men have because they maybe don't have the EQ or IQ?
I'm not sure. I think the one thing that will be to go full circle on this whole conversation, the one thing that will be scarce is attention and status. So if you think social media influencers are bad now, wait until everyone like has most of the core jobs AI assisted or reduced in terms of, so we have more time to spend on leisure. And I can almost promise you that will accrue more status and attention to the power law of people who are, and maybe there will be AIs who
They'll
get
be all
that.
AI too.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be weird, but
Yeah.
fundamentally the currency will be you're a human and you have X amount of hours per day that you're awake. Where is your attention being placed?
I want to segue into a topic that relates to topics we've been discussing, and it's prison, the prison problem. So we have a massive prison problem. The biggest problem, of course, is that there's a diversity problem. It's only men who go to prison, and we need 50-50 across. I'm just joking about that problem. But the problem is that we're sending too many people to prison for reasons that some of whom for reasons that they shouldn't be in prison, like marijuana thing or something, and it destroys families. Single parent households, et cetera. It just destroys communities, which leads to more crime. At the same time, we also have a huge crime problem, huge homicide problem, huge crime problem across the boards, particularly in certain inner cities. And so these are, directly in tension with each other. And so there's a simple answer, which is to say, hey, don't lock people up for stupid reasons and lock people up for genuine reasons. But then there are also kind of more extreme answers on both sides. One group of people says, hey, we should abolish prisons or drastically cut them down and instead invest in mental health and redistributive justice. And then there's the other side, and it's emboldened by the who's it, the El Salvador president? How do you pronounce his name?
Bukele or whatever. I actually don't know how to say it.
Who took a much more extreme stance and is locking up anyone who's been part of a gang, and not just locking up, but like I think in some cases doing death penalty, and he's just really sending a message that anyone who's a part of gang activity is going to be have their life ruined, basically. And he tweeted the other day that he says homicide has like gone down to 0 or something. Like he tweeted that and they had a massive gang problem. He equated it to denazification in Germany. He's like, when you have a Nazi problem, you need to do anything in your power to get rid of it. And so he's doing that on the extreme side. And so, and there's something that's attractive about that. Like, oh, we can end crime. That's really interesting. Like you just by just actually like, stick approach. But then there's also a message, the other group says, hey, that's not going to work. Or it doesn't work. And in fact, redistributive justice works because, people have souls and they acknowledge that they've made mistakes and these are mental health issues. There are reasons why they're doing the crime. And those reasons are that they've been wronged in some way. And so these are directly opposed perspectives. And I'm curious if you have a reaction to it.
Let's do El Salvador first. Let me start with like, I'm not pro crime. I think if you commit crime, you should face penalties. But let's kind of split them. So El Salvador, do you think El Salvador has cleaned up their crime process with what we would call due process? Kind of basic. Yeah. So you have an elected president who is taking a kind of extrajudicial approach to reducing crime. Effective, but there are downsides to that. Do you actually think that like they all got put in prison and they're just sitting in prison, or do you think there are a bunch of people who were executed and thrown in ditches? And
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah. There's
okay,
cost there.
yeah, significant cost,
They're
so
violating human rights, I would say.
right,
Yeah.
and so under the principle of if the opposite side of your political set of beliefs is now in charge and they get to have the same set of tactics, do you want to have those tactics? So from my point of view, separate like it's probably good for El Salvador from a like you've actually significantly reduced, which is a country that was essentially in narco tyranny and like of like just gangs. I mean that was why you had all these caravans coming up from El Salvador, and it's been that way for I don't know 20 years at least. Like people from El Salvador actually have something called TPS in the U.S. I'm always interested to see like when you talk to someone who has strong beliefs about immigration and then they like don't necessarily know all the details of like okay the different countries and how do you treat people, right? So TPS is it's temporary protective status. So if you're from El Salvador and you make it to the US, you can actually stay. And that's not a sanctuary city thing. That's a federal government program that they continue to extend. And the reason they had that from El Salvador is that the country was run by MS-13 and all this other kind of stuff. So getting the gang problem solved, I think, is a critical priority in a country where you have ineffective institutions. That probably the only practical way to solve it is through an extrajudicial, strong arm, aka executing people and being really really aggressive. So that's probably for that country's strategy of like trying to do that. That's probably one of the only ways to effectively do that. That said, we have the ability to kind of live in a society where we have extremely strong institutions, not necessarily effective, but that we 200 plus years of a constitution, like we made it through a civil war and we're able to come back together. So there's some staying power to U.S. institutions, especially our rule of law, assuming we kind of follow it. So I don't think that the El Salvador approach should even like there's no realistic version of that ever being done in the US. Now, could you look at the crime problem in the US and say how do we get more aggressive on this? Yes, but I actually think like so separate like cannabis or marijuana related offenses, which I think that's all been decarcerated at this point. Like at least in the progressive states and even in the states like a really conservative state like I think Mississippi passed a law that like medical marijuana is now like so that is actually becoming less and less of a kind of crime issue. But let's get into like two categories. So violent crime and fentanyl. So does anyone think like you're casually, and we talked about this with Michelle, like if you're dealing fentanyl, is this like, oops, oh, sorry, I didn't know. Like that there is no version of the world where you can make a good argument that it is a deadly substance, right? Like you're talking about like a little grain of sand amount and it kills the person. Absolutely no tolerance for that. Like that should just be a collective society of like you cannot deal fentanyl. Okay. So that's one, and there are a bunch of people who disagree with that because they're like, oh well, economic injustice is the reason they're dealing this deadly thing, right? So it would be interesting is like, okay, well, let's say cyanide didn't kill; it only killed 50% of people, and someone's dealing cyanide on the street. Does that same person think that? So now you're getting into this kind of like weird argument, like where it's like you're normalizing certain deadly substances and then others because like that's just it's happening like it's not logical in terms of the argument. Okay, violent crime. So what happens if you shoot someone? Should you go to jail? Is it like a race based thing? So it's like if you're one race like and you shoot someone, you should go to jail, and or if you shoot someone of a different race, you like so it's like a little matrix of like, oh well, if you're this type of person, it was because of your set of circumstances. So the shooting of a person is not as bad. But so like it's just like assault and battery is actually an interesting one because obviously they're different degrees. But like let's just take like gun violence and rape and like things that are just like okay do you think that there's a like some version of this where oh we should let these people out on bail and who's this new I've tried to avoid this because it's just like I don't want this culture war issue but I ended up seeing I think an article or two this Marine in New York. How many times had the guy that he choke held and killed been arrested?
A couple times or something.
44 times.
What? Oh my god.
Right? So we as a society need to figure that out. It's like, oh well, we need better mental health thing. Did the mental health like if he had gotten a little bit more, do you think he would have been? Oh, maybe he would have only been arrested 22 times. Like, so that I think is the fundamental issue. Is like people want a mood affiliation of how the world should be versus like how the world actually is. And I think like the other challenge, and I think that there was a chart actually this week on Twitter about this, whereas the percentage or the number of people in mental institutions or asylums and then the number of people in prison. So you reduce the number of people that are in these kind of like effectively mental health prisons, and then you just put them in the regular prison population. So we've effectively done that, where instead of actually being in something that is I don't even know the right terminology here, but like I view prison as kind of like a negative versus a mental health institution as at least like maybe there's a path to getting out based on your performance. I guess you have that with prison with pardon, but like the idea that like you serve a prison term, whereas with the mental health, like based on your just how you are, like maybe you can be re-released back into the regular society.
I want to double click on that because I used to actually be very, very sympathetic to this view, which is, I got really into nonviolent communication like a decade ago. And nonviolent communication is a communication framework for people to get in less conflicts. It's like conflict resolution. But it's also a broader worldview that says that among other things, it says that the reason why people commit violence, whether it's emotional or physical, is because they have some need that is not being met. It's because they have some challenge in their own life. And there's some truth to that, but it's also like implicit in that worldview, in this broader therapeutic worldview, it's kind of this very Christian idea. It's that everyone can be saved. If everyone just has the right amount of mental health or the right amount of people listening to them, the right amount of support, then they won't commit that act of violence. And that's the reason why they committed that act of violence. And implicit in that also is this kind of worldview around the state of nature, which is that people in default are kind and collaborative, and society does something to them which makes them violent, as opposed to the more like that's like more Rousseau, state of nature, as opposed to the more Hobbesian state of nature, where people are killing and attacking each other, and it's civilization or society that civilizes them, that gets them out of that. And if you think that everyone can be saved, well, then of course you're going to want redistributive justice. But if you think that, hey, they're actually just like that, one, the state of nature is killing and attacking, and that's like hardwired into us to be able to do acts like that, and also that there's just a certain amount of sociopaths out there, people who can't be saved, people who then you're going to be more focused on how do you protect the rest of society from those people, and is locking those people. Another question is like, is locking those people in a cage or putting them in prison for life, like, is that more humane than just killing them? Or is that better for society than this is a death penalty question? Yeah, a lot of thorny questions, but it really depends on kind of your worldview on the savability of humans and the reasons why they do it in the first place.
My sense on this one is it's a classic where if it's actually close to you, you can give me all the reasons why that family member in your family is you can't save them, or like they're self-destructive and like all these things, and you've spent a ton of time personally and you still don't do it. And when you rationalize like, hey, I'm just not going to engage with them anymore because it's a futile effort. Yet then you take the policy approach of like, oh well, if we just put a little bit more mental health into the world, like all of these problems will go away. Like, so it's a little bit of like, the stated preferences for the politics, but the revealed preferences when you actually have a difficult family member or someone close in your life, and like you just, it's extremely difficult. Humans are messy and very flawed. I think like just think about like all the types of problems that you of just like people right? And I think we've had long discussions about this of like you might have a close friend with a serious problem. Like, is it the expectation for you as the person to because they're your friend or family member, it's like you're just going to do that for the rest of your life? Is you are their support network, and anytime they are going through whatever the problem they have is, you have to kind of just smile and try to be supportive. And you can make the argument, okay, like maybe it's a relative thing. So if it's a child, like you have this kind of near infinite capacity for doing that, versus if it's a sibling, maybe a little less, or a parent, you do more, and if it's a friend, it depends how close they are, right? But I think like it, if you just take the approach of like, I would imagine nearly anyone listening to this has someone in their life where they just have this problem that, as much effort as you want to push on that, it's not going to fix. And so then if you just take that as a one data point and then you just extrapolate over 8 billion people, like obviously there's going to be a lot of people in the world where they're going to have some flaw that no matter how much human effort you put in, it is not going to change. And then so we as a society need to collectively say these are the flaws that we have no tolerance for, because it actually breaks down society. And these are the flaws that we're willing to kind of deal with, right?
Yeah. And because I've come to the view that most people probably can't be saved to some degree, some can, but like, people who commit crimes are likely going to, commit crimes. Then I think you have to come to the question as to like, who are you going to protect? The person that committed the crime, which has, real impact if you send them to prison, on their family and on their loved ones and obviously on them, or the person who the crime got committed against, the victim of the crime. And I'm still evolving on this issue and still learning, et cetera. But I do have to confess that like places like Singapore that have really stringent restrictions on certain issues that seem to have less of those crimes as a result. And I know Singapore is very different in the US in a bunch of different ways, but it does feel like the harder you are, if you do it in smarter ways, it will avert some sense of crime. And I do think that the people that are affected most by crime are the people that can't protect themselves. It's people who can't afford to live in gated communities, people who have live in cities that have the least amount of a budget for police, et cetera. And so,
But okay, so two things. So Singapore, they executed all their drug dealers. They still execute drug dealers. So like the Michelle Chandler, we should hang fentanyl dealers. Like they do that in Singapore. So 5 million people. This little city state that is extraordinary in a lot of different ways, but they execute their drug dealers, right? So data point. How was this problem solved prior to kind of call it post American, post-war 20th century America, like where the federal government really starts to flex its muscle in the pre World War II times? You're a poor Italian immigrant. Who's protecting you? Is it the Irish cop in New York? No, it's the mafia. It's you pay for protection, and then no one messes with Italian people in little Italy or whatever, because if some other group comes in and messes with the tribe, they're gonna get firebombed and whatever with and it's just like, okay, go back farther. That's the feudal system. The feudal system is literally you trade work, and I'm not arguing for that. I'm just pointing out it's like this is how society works. I give you protection, right? Like that's the deal, and so in a world where we can't collectively decide without wanting a feudal system or mafia or whatever, that we're going to have a base level of protection to protect those who are law abiding but weaker and don't have as many resources, you have serious breakdowns of society, right? Like and this is Antonio's point, is you turn into Brazil, right? Like the favelas in Rio are run by gangs, which mafias, and they can do whatever crime they want, but the reality is they get to decide what kind of crime happens. And then if you're wealthy, you live behind a gated community. I mean, it's the same thing in Mexico. So it's like it whether or not your mood affiliation on this is how it should be, like the reality of how this will translate is we will move, if the state is not providing it, it will move to models where you're basically under the de facto safety provisions from gangs, and they tend to be a lot more extractive.
So yeah, it's fascinating to look at different sort of solutions to these problems. Do you have one besides the status quo that you think might be better, or is it just all bad options in their own ways and hard? You don't have a point of view on it.
It's interesting because like I don't have much time to think about this stuff, in the sense that like I think what Michelle brought up on the podcast of like just get housing as a standard thing for getting people off the streets. I think it's like I think this is iterative, right? It's like let's try that experiment, right? Like let's get 10,000, or I mean maybe it needs to be 20,000 in San Francisco now, but like let's use San Francisco as a microcosm. Let's just get 20,000 beds. Like, ignore the NIMBYs or the local political thing. Just like steamroll that, build it in what's the neighborhood? Not Bayview, but it's between like Bayview and Dogpatch. Like there's just like a bunch of warehouses, like just eminent domain. Boom! Like we're gonna build the every night we're gonna sweep all of the homeless people off the street and force them to sleep in here, so that there's no tenant encampments or whatever. So let's see what happens at that point, and then from there it's like let's iterate. I think the second thing that again downstream or upstream of a lot of the issues in my view around kind of like whether you want to call it poverty, economic injustice that creates crime, homelessness, is housing just generally is too expensive. So like let's build more housing, right? Reduce the overhead to actually get more housing. Like let's get more companies like Cover. Our friend Delian invested in this, kind of company that is building. I think they're based here in LA, building homes in a factory. Like trailer parks got the kind of normalizes this like bad thing, but the reality is that's like mass produced housing that like we should be more aggressive about, like building more housing and kind of saying, hey, the way it works is you can't we're not allowing you to be homeless. Like we're going to move you to some state level property that we bought a huge chunk of land, or we did eminent domain, and we're going to put you in this park, and there are going to be mental health services here, but you are not allowed to be on the street in LA, right? Like or San Francisco. And so I think like that is the stuff that I would love to see society being more aggressive about. And if you reduce the amount of money people have to pay on housing, they have more money to spend on whatever they need, food, the other parts of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But I think shelter being an issue because we don't build anything, and California has this insane property tax regime. Like we just collectively as a society need to get past that and figure it out. So, but it's a classic incentives problem. Whereas now, if I'm in California and I've had to pay the 1% of the new price versus the person who's old, every year it goes by that I own my house, I'm now benefiting from this, and I'm becoming an older person who now wants to continue this policy. But I think if you had like a really good reformer in California that kind of was smart about it, it's like, okay, hey, we're gonna basically allow it for single family, we're gonna get rid of it for commercial. That got voted down from a prop standpoint, which is insane in my view. Like we should not be giving commercial real estate developers in California even above like a $5 million threshold to ignore the small businesses. Like they shouldn't be getting Prop 13. Like they should be paying full taxes. Like we should be getting all of that value back to the state. And not to say that the state is spending the money well, but like we should be solving those problems. And it just, instead we're doing committees in California about reparations for a state that never had slavery, and no one in the state of California has ever owned a slave. Like what? This makes no sense. It's like if you're an immigrant from Asia and you've moved to California and you've worked your ass off to have whatever, and now the state is saying, oh, by the way, you coming from some really hard circumstance and you've kind of done everything in your life right, and you've paid taxes and you've done all this stuff. By the way, you need to go pay reparations for something that happened, 150 plus years ago, and the state didn't even have any slaves. It's just so stupid. Like it's like housing is the problem. Solve housing.
I think that's a good place to wrap. A couple disclaimers before we do. This is a fascinating discussion. In some places we went a bit abstract, which is cool. But I do want to acknowledge that there are many people who are deeply struggling, and their depression or mental health issues are totally valid. And I also want to shout out, there are many people, whether it's mental health professionals or social workers or whoever who are trying to save people. And I think that work is admirable and honorable and worth doing. And then also, there are people like policemen and others who are keeping our communities safe, and so many people who are doing great work in these areas. Speaking of people who can't be saved, our friend Antonio, moves every month, and if you want to see him here more often, he is Jewish now, so He's susceptible to guilt. Just guilt him constantly. Get in his DMs. Ask him why he's not an MOZ. If you want to see Catherine or Solana or dear friends as more regular occurring guests, do DM them. Let them know as well. And yeah, Dan, thanks as always. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, let me add on the mental health. Depression does exist, right? Like I'm not living in some fantasy world than that. I think it's I think there's the macro picture of like society is more depressed is where I'm taking issue with versus individual circumstances obviously are individual, right? So like there are definitely people out there in the world who are dealing with some brutal shit, okay? But I think that we can separate the like your personal circumstance is different from a macro trend, right? In at least from my point of view, in terms of like if we're arguing, I am not trying to say that you are not depressed. What I'm trying to say is, are people more depressed?
Totally. And also lots of conservatives struggle too. They don't call it depression, the opioid crisis, et cetera. Also, but not to, but while we're on this topic, I had a very close friend in college who struggled with depression so much that it ended her life. And her parents have started a foundation. It's called the Jordan Elizabeth Harris Foundation. They do suicide prevention work, and I've donated there, and they do a lot of tremendous work. Anyways, there's so many people doing tremendous work. So, I don't want our views to be strawmanned or, in that kind of way. So I appreciate the disclaimers.
Yeah. Look, I think the reality is people are going to try to dunk or clip or say whatever, but like at least if it's at the back of the thing that you can kind of clap back in a downside scenario. I don't think most of our haters actually listen to this podcast.
No.
If you're a hate listener of this podcast, leave it in the comments.
Yeah, do let us know. So we have a lot of people who want to meet up. Someone suggested a New York City meetup. I know you're heads down building Farcaster and your family, but maybe at some point in LA or something in the future if it's easy. But I want to help Moment of Zen people meet each other at some point.
Yeah, I think we could do that. I will actually leave one little thing here as an experiment. If you send me a DM with the word Arizona and you mention MOZ, so just MOZ in the DM, including the word Arizona because that's how I filter it. I'd just be curious, like if you're interested in checking out Farcaster. I've actually had a lot of you reach out, which is cool. But yeah, I think you might find other MOZ fans on Farcaster and or just people who are kind of interesting and quirky. And it's a different time. It's back to a different time of how social media, it was actually more social networking. And I think what's been cool about Farcaster, at least in this early stage, right, there's about 10,000 people using it, is people are building meaningful relationships with other people around the world online, not knowing each other, not having met each other in person. And then they meet up in person. So I would just give that plug and feel free to send me a Twitter DM.
And let me just quickly double up on that just plus one that Farcaster is where I get the best perspective on what we should do with Moment of Zen or meet the most interesting people. And, Twitter is like a late stage social network. It's harder to meet people. It's harder to rise up, kind of build a reputation on the site. But I've kind of seen a number of really interesting people on Farcaster who've kind of grown their audience or network or relationships on Farcaster. And that's sort of the benefit of early stage social networks. And I want to do a deep dive on Farcaster at some point soon. Maybe we'll do a town hall or AMA or Q&A or something, just like someone tweeted asking for like, hey, want to know more about Farcaster's evolution. And so one, I appreciate the Farcaster community for all they've contributed to Moment of Zen. If you're not a Farcaster, I recommend you getting on. And let's do a future episode where we do a deep dive on where you're going.
I could do a show podcast. I mean, Antonio's usually the one who's doing the show, but
exactly.
I can flip on the sales mode anytime you need me to.
Perfect. Awesome. Dan, well, thanks as always.
Good to see you, bud.
Secureframe is the leading all-in-one platform for security and privacy compliance. Secureframe helps you get SOC 2 audit ready in weeks, not months, and it's used by thousands of companies like AngelList, Coda, and Remote. I believe in the company so much I invested in it, and I recommend it to all my portfolio companies. Sign up for a free demo at secureframe.com and mention Moment of Zen during your demo to get 20% off your first year of Secureframe.
MarketerHire is one of my favorite resources for growing startups looking to hire marketers. Hiring is hard, and the time it takes from founders could be better leveraged elsewhere. MarketerHire pre-vets top-notch marketers across a dozen roles, whether you need help with growth marketing, SEO, lifecycle content, or any other aspect of growth marketing strategy. It's free to use, and you only pay if you end up hiring someone. If you want to hire a great marketer the easy way, MarketerHire is offering Moment of Zen listeners a $1,000 credit for first-time customers. Go to marketerhire.com/MOZ and use code MOZ for your $1,000 credit.